My name is Jose Deliz. I'm a project manager branch head here at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. I work in the South Atlantic AOR, and I see that in the audience we have people from the FIAD. Welcome aboard. I see some project managers, and I see some design manager or prospective design managers. And so thank you for coming. This presentation is being brought to you by popular demand, and it is about post-award design management. I'm going to be talking about, why are we doing this presentation? I'm going to give you a quick list of references that are used for the course material. We're going to be talking about the sequence during post-award for design management. Going to touch quickly on submittals. And before we head into the questions, or somewhere in between, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Davis or Mr. Bernard, who will make a quick spiel about the use of ECMs during post-award design management. So rolling into the problem statement, just remember we have the room until 2:30, so let's keep interruptions to the minimum. Why are we doing this? Well, ECB 2017 PAC 02 essentially dictated that we cut down on the number of project managers. NAVFAC Southeast at the time had twice as many design managers, and at the time those project managers were double-hatted as design managers also. So one of the direct results of the reduction in the number of project managers is that the design manager function is not a billet. The function was transferred to the technical teams with the idea that project managers will now have double the workload as PMs, and the design manager function will be handled by the tech teams. Along the way, we've had to overcome the lack of experience from our current staff in the technical teams to perform that DN function. And one of the things that we found out the hard way, I seem to be stumbling a lot onto these, complicated problems, is that project managers handled design management post-award differently than design managers do now while being performed at the technical team. And a lot of it has to do with personalities, a lot of it has to do with the way their battle rhythm, if you will. Design managers in tech teams tend to be more detail-oriented about reviewing the actual designs that project managers did. And so we faced a couple of situations where that attention to detail brought light on the fact that there are a number of things that were not being done correctly. So as a result, we were asked to put together a presentation to essentially disseminate the standards and the requirements on a contract for design management so that we can ensure consistency, quality, and timeliness within the contractual parameters. This is also to establish a measure of standardization. So here are my references. I'm pulling from the BMS, specifically BMS for post-award design management, schedule for design build construction, and design build technical submittals. I'm going to be talking a lot about the requirements in the UFGS specifications. There's 4 of them listed there. There's many more, but the core of what I'm about to talk about lies in those 4 specifications. And then there's the UFC that you're all familiar with, UFC 1300-09N, which covers the NAVFAC design procedures. So, along the line, I'm going to ask you to keep in mind these key concepts. Teamwork, communications, scalability, which is very important, flexibility and documentation. And surrounding and underlying all of that is a concept of judgment. You're going to be required as a design manager to exercise your judgment along those key concepts that I just outlined. So jumping right into it, we awarded a construction contract. There's a lot of congratulations and felicitations going on. Everybody's like high-fiving each other. We brought it across the finish line. And as Mike will tell you, that's just the start. It's not the finish. That's when the fun starts. So what do we do now? We awarded a design build project. Obviously, I'm not going to be talking about design bid build projects because they don't have post-award design management. So what happens first after construction contract award? And this is something that we always take for granted. And I mentioned to Tiffany yesterday, I've been in NAVFAC Southeast 11 years and awarded more than 200 contracts. And I just attended my second contract turnover meeting yesterday. It should happen on every contract. You have a procuring contracting officer, and you got an administering contracting officer. And what I'm talking about is on large projects where we procure the contract here at the FAC, at some point it has to be transferred over to the field office for contract administration. And that is that very first post-award meeting that we take for granted. To my knowledge, not that many people pay attention to it, but it can be a very valuable resource to you as a design manager. That meeting is the official handoff from the FEC to the FIAT, and at that point, there should be some communication explaining this is what the project is, these are the boundary conditions, this is what happened during solicitation, all the useful information that the field needs to know in order to properly manage the contract from that point on. But for the purposes of this presentation, I would like you to pay attention to that second bullet, because as design managers, you might see your role as very limited in that kind of meeting, but this is actually your opportunity to get your digs in early and tell and dictate to the FIAT, these are the things that we need to focus on right away. Before we do anything else, we need to talk about how to interface with the contractor. Who's going to be carrying the lead during the design process? Is the FIAT's expectation that the design manager be the lead during the design, or is the FIAT's expectation that the construction manager, the CM, will be the lead and communicate back to the FIAT for design-related issues? You can also talk about, stuff that happened during the solicitation, talk about the description of the project and how that project got modified during solicitation via PPI responses. And as far as timeliness, actually there's very little guidance on it on the BMS. It just says that it has to occur as quickly as possible. So normally I would expect that contract turnover meeting to occur within 2 weeks of award, except that we know at the end of the year it's a crazy mess. So it might take longer, but the idea is to hold that meeting as early as possible and you as the design manager be part of the driver of that meeting so that you can communicate to the people in the field what your expectations are for design. One of the topics that you might want to cover, and I highly encourage you to cover this topic at the turnover meeting, is the actual PAC meeting. And what is a PAC meeting? Well, it's actually a bunch of different meetings under the umbrella of PAC. And up to this point, the perception up here has been that the PAC meeting is run by the CM. So why should you as a DM or a PM attend that meeting? Well, there's several components in the definition of PAC meeting, which I will get into really quickly. Just wanted to point out that prior to holding the PAC, the PM or the DM communicates to the CM what is going to be needed prior to the post-award kickoff meeting. For example, the consolidated RFP documents, if required in a certain specification. We're going to talk about the concept plan that's going to be used in the concept design workshop, if there is one. You might want to talk about the quality control plan, or actually you want to review the quality control plan before you get in the first meeting with a contractor. The design communications plan is essentially the same as the design quality control plan, but it's worded differently in a different specification. You might want to talk about safety, but that's really more of a CM type driven agenda. And the schedule, the all important schedule. You know, these are the things that you as a DM will probably want to require prior to the PAC meeting. Again, judgment. It's up to you as a design manager if you actually want to toe the line, but there's very specific reasons why you want these items submitted first. So let's talk a little bit about the concept design. In the UFC 1300N talks about the concept design that can be the contractor's technical response to the RFP. And here's where you need to fight a little bit of a fight, because the urban myth out there is that whatever's in the proposal is what you bought. And I know ACQ is guilty of promulgating that story. It's not the case, not according to the FC. You can use the technical solution in the proposal as your starting point for the concept plan. But just as easily, if you word your RFP correctly, you can disclaim it and make sure the contractor understands that whatever they propose as a concept plan will only be used to evaluate their proposal and may not be suitable as a concept plan moving forward after award. And that happened to me in one case where we reviewed proposals, and it's obvious that the contractors understood the requirements of the RFP, therefore the proposals were acceptable, but the way the facility was laid out was not functional. So before we got into the concept design workshop, we did tell the contractor, look, your proposal was okay, but that's not the floor plan we want. And we told them specifically, you know, these are the changes you will need to make before we can consider that floor plan acceptable. That layout doesn't work. That's one example where we did not buy what was in the proposal. And it so happens the RFP was worded specifically by saying, you know, whatever you submit in your proposal, still going to have to scrub it through the design process according to the specifications. The preliminary schedule, that has been a topic of hot discussion recently out here. The specifications say that prior to holding the PAC meeting, the contractor needs to submit a cost-loaded schedule. In reality, doesn't need to either specify construction activities, and it doesn't need to be submitted like 2 weeks ahead. The schedule has to be presented at the PAC meeting. That's the only requirement. Now, it doesn't need to be approved. The schedule needs to be approved before the contractor submits invoices. That is correct. But it doesn't need to be approved prior to the CDW. So one of the things that we're trying to correct here was the impression that the contractor has to submit a cost-loaded schedule ahead of the PAC meeting and get it approved before the PAC meeting could take care. That's not what the specification says, so here's a clarification. So what is a PAC meeting? Like I mentioned, it's actually a bunch of meetings. There's a meeting that talks about contract administration. That's really between the ACO and the contractor, where they discuss, you know, stuff like bonds and entrance to the installation. There's a partnering meeting when required, a concept design presentation / design development, or a concept design workshop, or otherwise known as a CDW. And then there's a scheduling. The PAC meeting could take many forms. It could be, you can have one meeting that consolidates all these activities in one event, or you can actually, for large projects, break out these events into discrete meetings. Again, for small projects, you may elect to have them at the, like if you got a simple demo project, your PAC meeting can be in the contracting officer's office or conference room half a day or maybe less. But if you're carrying a large honking milk on, well, it would be prudent to separate these events into discrete meetings. And again, that's also dictated in your specifications. There's a place where you specify where you want to have informal partnering or formal partnering. You can indicate whether you're going to have a CDW or not, et cetera, et cetera. Since you're going to be writing the specifications, you get to dictate the outcome. Again, judgment is the key. It's up to you to decide what is best for the customer and the Navy. The PAC meeting does have some required outcomes, and those are listed in specification 0131-1905. And here's a bullet list of the required outcomes from the PAC meeting that it behooves you to achieve in order to maintain compliance with the contract. The first requirement is to integrate the contractor and all client representatives into the project team, which is also called partnering. We want to establish policies and procedures that will define what is a successful project, establish clear lines of communications and point of contacts for the government and contractor teams. That's also very important. That's something that you all are used to. That's one of the very first things that I specify at every event is, okay, your official point of contact is going to be the construction manager. Don't come to me as a project manager asking questions. Every question has to be routed or at least copied to the construction manager, because in reality, he is the contracting officer's authorized representative. You're not. So none of you have the authority to respond on behalf of the government unless you have his permission or the contracting officer's permission. You want to talk about the technical proposal and resolve any issues you may have. You want to establish clear expectations for the concept design workshop. If you're going to require that they serve breakfast, for example, or sometimes the contractor may have a question about whether they can hold the CDW in the FIAD's office. And you might require them to follow the contract and book a hotel conference room and do a formal event. Stuff like that. At the end of the PAC meeting, actually at the end of the concept design workshop, is very important. Obtain an acceptable conceptual design. That's going to be your starting point moving forward from design at the end of the CDW. That requires actually several things, which I will get to in a minute. And establish a project design schedule, design submittal packaging, and preliminary construction schedule. This is actually something that I found out very recently, and I had to look into it because I didn't know what it was. Design submittal packaging refers to the fact that many contractors, and often you'll see that in large projects, they want to do what they call early start packages. So they want to segregate, for example, the site civil and the structural and submit a specific design for that, while the rest of the facility is designed separately. That is actually something that you can approve or disapprove, but it has to be discussed at the PAC, whether they can do it or not. But it's different from the actual fast tracking of a design. In a fast track design, you have one design submittal where portions of it can be more mature than the others. And based on one design submittal, you can approve contractor to proceed with certain activities like site clearing or laying down the foundations. What design submittal packaging refers to is if you're going to have multiple design submittals, you're going to have a 35% building design submittal at the same time as 100% site civil and structural submittal. Again, the important thing to remember, that's a proposal. It's not an allowance. The contractor has to seek permission from you guys, and at that moment you will have to specify whether his proposal is acceptable to you or not. I've seen in one case where the proposal was, okay, we'll submit the fast track package, site civil and structural, and give the government 5 days to approve. And in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and order the supplies. Well, we find that totally unacceptable. You know, we require 20 days for approve or to review and approve or disapprove. And not until we approve or disapprove, you're clear to go ahead and purchase material. That's just an example. More required PAC meeting outcomes. Discusses design milestones and events that will be included in quality control communication plans. That usually takes a form of a contractor asking if they can skip the 65% and go straight to 100%. That happens a lot, but you can discuss it, you know, You can regulate the pace of the design process up to you using your judgment. Sometimes when you got a small demo project, you might tell the guy, I don't want to see a concept plan, just send me the 100% because we want to knock this out quick. Other times when you got a very complicated facility that you have to go through the design, you might require them to go through the process of concept plan, 35, 65, 100, and final. You know? Again, establish a procedure for design package reviews. How the contractor is going to resolve comments, for example, the use of DR checks or ECMs. And mostly this is a FIAT thing. The facility turnover, 1354, EOMC, stuff like that are usually covered by the FIAT based on their preference. The last one I know very little about, but I do know that we require BIM for something. I just don't know what it is. Do you? I don't think anybody uses BIM. But it's a required meeting outcome, so you got to talk about it. So the partnering meeting, what is it? As opposed to the PAC meeting, there's no required meeting outcomes from the partnering meeting. It could be it's very simple, hey, my name is Jose, I'm the project manager, nice to meet you, Mr. Contractor, or it could be a very involved thing that requires a moderator facilitated in a off-site venue like a hotel conference room. It takes a whole day of what I would loosely consider bonding, you know, with bonding exercises and presentations on how to achieve the common purpose and identifying what priorities are for each particular group. The customer might have different priorities than you as a project manager and different still from the contractor. You know, as a project manager, budget, schedules, and scope. Those are my priorities. The contractor may have a priority on cost, or the customer has a priority on quality, you know. But that's what has anybody ever been to a formal partnering meeting? Okay, so I don't need to talk about it that much. Well, the takeaway is there is a partnering, on a formal partnering meeting, there's a facilitator and he needs to submit a resume for review and approval prior to the partnering meeting. Other than that, as I said, it could be formal or informal. If you specify a formal partnering, there are some required parameters. For example, the separate venue at the contractor's cost could be actually catered. A facilitator, which means they require for a prior submittal of their qualifications. The initial meeting is required to be a minimum of 1 day off-site, and follow on, let's call them refreshing partnering meetings at 3 to 6 month interval. Again, based on your judgment. That's actually formal partnering, and I have almost never seen that. But we're going to start doing it because corporate NAVFAC wants us to. The informal partnering, as I said, could be anything less than that. And it could be as simple as a phone call. So the part that everybody has fun at is a concept design workshop. And usually I find that we do it very poorly. And this is a good opportunity for you guys to focus on what's important and try to obtain a better outcome of the concept design workshop. There are two variants. There's the concept design presentation / design, or DPD meeting, which is suitable for small projects. Again, I'm going to rely on the example of a demo project where the contractor just shows this is what I plan to do, and you talk about it. The more intensive variant is a concept design workshop. Again, usually held off-site. Sometimes takes as much as a week or more. Sometimes it takes less. But that's where you get a chance to actually do some deep digging into the crafting of the actual concept plan, which should be based on your room requirements as laid out, the space tabs, the room requirements, and the ESRs laid out in the RP. And that's what you want to do at the concept plan, is focus on developing the first step in the design process. Again, you can use a technical solution in the proposal as a starting point, up to you. You can actually start from scratch if you want. You can actually refer back to the 1391 if you have one, if it has a floor plan that you prefer. One thing that most people forget about is the contractor should have a printer or a copier available during the concept design workshop. How many people have ever seen one? I haven't. Usually they wind up asking the hotel clerk to, produce copies of something. But it's important because everybody has to sign that concept plan at the end. The contractor should also bring the scheduler and the cost estimator, for the simple reason that at the end they got to verify that all changes will remain within budget and period of performance. In other words, at the end of the CDW, you have an agreement from all parties. This is what we want to roll with. And the contractor is also providing assurances that, yeah, he can do it within the cost and the schedule that it was agreed upon. That's why it's important to bring those people to the CDW. So, talking about interim design submittal reviews. This is something that you guys are familiar with because you do it on a daily basis. Pre-award. So post-award, it's not that much different, but there's some things that are. For one thing, review and comment during the design process, or pre-award design process, sometimes is late and nobody thinks too much of it. Post-award, it's critical that your design review comments are plugged into the system in a timely manner, because if you don't, that means money. That means the contractor is getting delayed and the government will have to pay extra at the tune of roughly $3,000 a day for extended overhead. I mentioned before, specification 0130-11905 requires the contractor submit a proposal for design submittal packaging subject to government approval. This is also different from your pre-award design process, where you have different design packages floating around that you have to review and comment and close out comments. And it creates quite a burden on your slim resources. I want to talk about distinction here. All the time we hear about the government is charged with quality control. The government doesn't do quality control. The government does quality assurance. There's a distinction. It's a contractor's burden to provide quality control of the design. I'm going to talk about it in more detail a little bit later. Here's something that you do post-award that is of critical importance. On a design-build contract, specifically complicated large projects, where you start out with a concept plan, and during the maturing of that design, you'll realize there are some things that you have to change in your scope. It is highly recommended that you keep track of those scope changes and their estimated value as the design progresses. And it's very important that you and the contractor both track those design scope variations and that you're in lockstep. Because at the end of the design process, before the contracting officer can issue a notice to proceed with construction, they had to essentially close and balance the books on those scope changes. Because the design contains something that's not in the RFP, a modification has to be issued to incorporate those change criteria and change requirements into the contract. And at that point, if you got scope changes that are cost loaded, for lack of a better term, you will have to at some point negotiate that with a contractor. So it behooves you to keep track of those at the same time as the contractor, so that at the end you don't waste time negotiating fruitlessly and delaying the project because you can't agree on the value of those scope changes. I added this bullet here, and this is something word on the street is that we have never used it. What we should. And in fact, we're getting strong signals from headquarters that the change criteria process is going to be followed. I don't know what is going to be enforced. So what that means is that the customer cannot simply show up and tell you, yeah, we need to change that room into a skiff. Remember? Or, yeah, we thought about it and we're going to put more servers in, so we need more cooling capacity. In the past, we've been pegged on the eager to please matrix. The result of that eagerness to please the customer and the Public Works Department is that corporate NAVFAC has been taking a beating for projects that are late and over budget. So this is one way to control those customer requested changes and change criteria. Essentially, it forces a customer to estimate the value of those changes and get the change approved by his commanding officer, and it has to be endorsed by the Public Works officer. Sometimes, depending on the value, it also needs to be endorsed by the region before you incorporate those changes into the contract. It creates a burden for the customer that he may not want to carry. So you essentially eliminate the poorly thought out scope criteria changes, things like that. You still have to incorporate changes based on unforeseen set conditions or design omissions, but purely for change of criteria. If you're going to get beaten up by being late or over budget, they're going to get wet too. And this is not really a forum to talk about fire, but just know that during the post-award design process, you will have to engage the designer record and put him in contact with the RPAO so they can put together not the initial 1354, which should be in the RFP, but the, what do we call the draft. The draft 1354, which includes the quantities for those elements in the 1354. Again, this is not a fire, so I don't want to focus too much on this. Just mentioning it because many people forget there's a 1354 that has to be completed at some point, and this is the time to engage on it. Again, the final design submittal, final modification notice to proceed is something that is different post-award than it is pre-award. The acceptance of a fast-track design package or the overall design package is what triggers the need for a notice to proceed with construction. So I mentioned before, the final design submittal usually requires a request for proposal to encapsulate the scope deviations and agree on a new revised contract cost. And it helps if you have been tracking those, I call it a matrix of changes and their respective costs. At which point the contract is finally furnished with a notice to proceed with construction activities. It also, this is essentially the step where the construction manager takes a more active role in managing the contract than the design manager, because you are now proceeding with construction activities. So as a design manager, you basically fade into the background and support the contract, the construction manager as issues arise during construction. And at the very end, the 1354 is updated with the final qualities the quantities according to the design. Talk a little about submittals. And yes, I left this for last because, again, subject to interpretation, using your judgment as a design manager. In my opinion, based on several instances of getting my eyebrows singed off, I have developed this algorithm of submittals, which is what I consider the optimal sequence. Once you award a contract, the very first submittal should be the consolidated RFP documents for obvious reasons. The consolidated RFP incorporates all the changes made during the solicitation process. Should be a starting point for everything else that follows. There's a certificate of insurance and surety bonds that are required by the contract, which you don't get involved in at all because it's a transaction between the contractor and the contracting officer. And the FIAT also requires upfront a list of contract personnel for the contractor and their subs. Again, not really your swim lane, but those are the three submittals that need to happen like immediately upon award. Prior to the to the PAC, I believe, in my opinion, the very first submittal you should receive is a design quality control plan. Why? Because that's where you will find the qualifications of your quality control manager. And you get to approve him. Every other submittal follows needs to be signed by the quality control manager. So how is that going to happen unless you approve the qualifications of the quality control manager up front? Obviously, the second submittal after that is the submittal register. That gives you a roadmap of what's coming. And notice I'm talking about the design submittal register. There's a number of submittals required on the contract for materials and stuff. At this point, we're only concerned about the design submittal register. We require a proposed conceptual plan for you to review prior to the PAC meeting. Then you have the safety pre-design submittals and environmental protection plan. If you're going to have a standalone partnering meeting, you also need the partnering facilitator qualifications. Prior to the CDW, where's the schedule? Yeah, I forgot the schedule. Suffice to say, the schedule is required right here at the CDW.
Design baseline, anything else?
Oh, that's where it is. Design baseline schedule, network analysis schedule is required prior to the concept design workshop. Again, you want to review, if there's a proposal for design submittal packaging, you want to review it before you roll into the CDW. You have to at least have an idea of what the schedule looks like. Why? Because as the design manager, believe it or not, you get to review and approve the cost loading of design activities. It's very important. You know that most contractors will try to front load their contracts. So if 50% of the contract value is assigned to design, at that point you can tell them, no, that's not going to work. And you have to do that early, right? And CDW cost estimate, almost always forgotten, but it's actually required. After the CDW, you get your CDW report, which has a bunch of very useful and important information, such as the design concept plan that you all agreed to, the design baseline network analysis schedule, how it was agreed upon to package the design, an updated cost estimate, and the initial matrix of scope changes that I've been talking about. So, if that's what your eventual project looks like, you got work to do. But anyway, having said all that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about ECMS.
Jose reached out to me, asked that we come by and talk briefly about ECMS, which I'm not going to do. John Bernard, our senior construction manager over here, is going to talk a little bit about ECMS and the use of the program. But I just wanted to take an opportunity here to talk about a few items that I feel are very important coming from the pre-award side to post-award side, and that Jose talked about it was a turnover meeting, how very few times he's done it, but the impact it has on the post-award management of the contract is significant. So it really gives a good opportunity for the pre-award staff, the procuring contracting officer, the design manager, PM, to meet with the construction manager, engineering technician, administrating contracting officer to talk about the project, all the technical amendments that were issued, unique aspects of the project, and just to meet face to face, know who's who. Because before that, we're off doing all of our management of active construction projects. You guys are doing all your design stuff, and this is really a good opportunity to sit down together and communicate that information. One other item was talking about, and I've learned this the hard way, moving to post-award, is being flexible. We have, right now at Jacksonville, we have, I think, something like 70 to 80 active construction projects ongoing. Our CMs have anywhere from upwards of 20 projects they're managing at any given time. And they've got to keep the projects moving, because if we hit unforeseens, we have delays, that results in costs. We have extended overhead fees upwards of $1,000 a day sometimes that's going to build up. So we've got, we've got to act quick, we've got to be flexible, we've got to be able to make decisions. So just something to recognize, as an engineer looking at the requirements of the contract and trying to be somewhat flexible with the construction manager managing the project post-award. So I think that's really about it. Like I said, the primary reason we're here is so we can talk briefly about ECMS, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to John.
When I started, they gave me a pretty good sized project day one, and the contracting officer walked in the door, gave me a 6-page document, said, sign this. And I started reading it. It was all my responsibilities as the contracting officer's representative. And I read through it. Personally liable was in there about 3 times. Huge responsibilities, listed it in great detail. Number 1 was file management. So everything I'm going to talk about is file management. But I want to go back to the presentation. All of this should be talked about at the turnover meeting. So we all get together, plan how we're going to conduct the PAC meeting, who's going to need what time, what schedules. So all that can be worked out well in advance, and then the PAC meeting should go very smoothly. In the past, I show up to the PAC meeting, I have to ask Mr. Contractor, what are we doing? I mean, literally, please make a presentation on your understanding of this project. And then we get into the discussions. So this turnover meeting is absolutely critical. ECMS, I'm just going to talk about it very, very briefly. Again, it is our file management system. When I started, we're using paper, emails, computer submittals, and then third-party submittal management programs. Impossible to put all that together at the end of the project. ECMS combines all of that. And what I'll suggest today is when you start, I did this with Mike Cassidy yesterday, call the construction manager. I can walk you through in about 15 minutes how to get through it, the difficult parts and the easy parts. It'll get you going very, very quickly. It's basically that simple, but we desperately need it in our office because it records everything. Contractors are having the same struggles because they're used to different programs. So I'm having to walk them through it. We're slowly getting up to speed on their use of the program. Daily reports. We traditionally get emails, paper copies, PDFs, daily reports. Well, all that's in ECMS. So right now I'm telling contractors, you can email it to me, but I need it uploaded some point in time down the road. ECMS has a drop-down menu list, so they can do it online. Now think about it, superintendent's doing that. It's just not going to happen. So this is going to be a slow process getting up to speed, so be patient. The CMs obviously are going to be very proficient in it by the time you start talking, so that'd be your best bet, is to talk to them. And that's all I want to talk about, because it gets pretty detailed if you want to go into the actual program.
So to wrap this up, let me, first of all, I wanted to echo the comments from John. In my opinion, ECMS is a huge step forward from the way we used to do business before. Not long ago, we used to take submittals via email. And then we would save those emails to our shared drive, only to find out that the shared drive became corrupted, and now we have no data on a number of projects. That is a huge thing when you consider all these cases that are moving towards claims and court cases, and we don't have any kind of backup documentation. We started using something called submittal exchange at some point. I don't know if anybody ever used it. We found out there's a huge problem with submittal exchange in that we don't control that data. In one of my projects, a contractor went bankrupt, and now we no longer have the ability to retrieve any RFIs or submittals from the submittal exchange because it's a paid subscription. So ECMS comes in at a great time. To me, it's a huge step forward, provided that eventually they figure out how to make it work consistently, because that's a noise I'm getting, is that sometimes or often doesn't work. I think it'll be a great improvement. I also want to backtrack a little bit. I kind of skipped over this little bullet here. I want to talk very briefly about it. There's a popular misconception, urban myth, if you will, that if you don't catch the design mistake or omission, then the contractor is free and clear. Sometimes you will face that, a contractor will say, well, you know, you approved the final design even though it contains some errors, so now if you want me to fix those errors, it's going to cost you extra. It actually happens a lot. That UFGS specification 0133, section 1.671 actually specifically talks about how the contractor is not relieved of their responsibility because the government performs quality assurance. We do not perform quality control. And it remains their responsibility and their burden to produce a design that is suitable. So if you catch a mistake at the end of the project, the contractor is still responsible for doing it and fixing it, even though you may not catch it during your design review. Just keep that in mind. Anyway, that is pretty much as far as my presentation is concerned.